You walk past them every autumn, thousands of them, scattered under the oak trees, cracking under your shoes on the sidewalk. Acorns, squirrel food, the yard litter you rake into a bag and drag to the curb. You have probably never once thought of an acorn as dinner. But a peasant in the winter of 1316 looked at that same nut and saw the difference between living until spring and dying in the mud. Because in that year, across northern Europe, the bread had run out. The rain had fallen for 2 straight summers. The wheat rotted in the fields, and the cattle were dropping dead in the pastures by the hundreds of thousands. People walked into the forest and gathered the one food the rain could not destroy. There was only one problem. Eaten raw, an acorn will make you violently sick. It carries a natural poison strong enough to shut down the kidneys of a full-grown cow. The peasants knew this. They ate it anyway, and they lived. How do you take a nut that poisons livestock and turn it into a loaf of bread that keeps your family alive through a famine? That is what we are digging up today. Let's go back to the spring of 1315. The rain starts falling across England, France, and Germany, and it does not stop. Not for weeks. For 2 years. Fields turn to swamp. Grain that should ripen gold in the sun rots black on the stalk. Then the animals begin to die. A disease sweeps through the herds, and by some accounts up to 80% of the sheep and cattle in parts of Europe are gone. This is the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and it is still ranked as the worst famine in European history, measured by how much of the population it killed. In southern England, historians estimate 10 to 15% of people died. Some towns lost as many as 1 in 4. The price of grain tells the rest of the story. A quarter of wheat that sold for around 5 shillings in 1313 climbed to 20 shillings by 1316. 4 times the price, in 3 years, for the one thing everyone needed to survive. A Benedictine monk named Johannes de Trochalova was alive to write it down. He recorded that people could no longer afford to feed their pigs, and that the poor were eating things no one should ever have to eat. His chronicle is grim, and some of it was written to shock, so we take the darkest parts with caution. But the core is not in doubt. People were starving, desperate, and looking for anything that would fill a stomach. And the food they turned to was the food they normally threw to their animals. In a normal year, acorns were pig food. Medieval villagers had a rite called pannage, which let them drive their hogs into the forest each autumn to fatten on the acorn fall before slaughter. An acorn was not human food. To eat acorns yourself was to admit you had sunk to the level of your own livestock. This was already old knowledge by the Middle Ages. The Greek physician Galen, in the 2nd century, noted that farmers stored acorns as winter pig feed, but when the grain harvest failed, the people ate the acorns themselves. Earlier still, Pliny the Elder recorded something more specific. When corn is scarce, he wrote, acorns are dried, ground into flour, and kneaded into bread. The famine did not invent acorn bread. It just forced a continent to remember it. But you cannot simply grind up an acorn and bake it. Try that, and you will spend the next day doubled over. How did they make it safe? That is where the real work begins. Everything depends on the acorn you choose. There are 2 broad families of oak, and the difference between them was a matter of health. White oaks, the sweeter kind, carry a relatively low load of the bitter compound. Red oaks carry far more, in some cases several times as much. A medieval forager did not know the chemistry, but they knew by taste and hard experience which trees gave the gentler nut. Choose wrong, and you multiplied your labour, or worse, you got sick anyway. Then comes the sorting, and it is picky work. Throw out any acorn still capped, because a capped acorn is unripe. Any with a crack, because a crack lets in mould. Any with a small round hole, because that hole is the exit wound of a weevil grub that has already eaten the meat inside. A simple trick sped this up. Drop them in water and the good heavy ones sink while the hollow ruined ones float off the top. Now the shelling. This is the first grind of real labour. Each nut has to be cracked and the woody shell peeled away from the meat inside. One at a time, by hand. Picture a medieval family in the long evenings of autumn, gathered close around a single fire. Everyone has a job. The children pick through the pile, the adults crack and peel, and the old people whose eyes are failing but whose hands still work, sort the clean meats into a basket. The steady knock of stone on shell goes on for hours, night after night, because a family needs pounds of the stuff for it to matter. Once shelled, the meats are ground into a coarse, damp meal, and now the family is holding a basket of poison. This is the obstacle the whole process exists to defeat. Raw acorn meat is loaded with a bitter chemical your body cannot handle in quantity. It tastes so astringent it dries out your whole mouth. Eat enough of it and you get cramping, nausea, and real strain on your organs. That meal in the basket is not food yet. It has to be washed clean of its poison first. The medieval solution is water and a great deal of patience. The ground meal goes into a basket or loose woven sack set in running water or in a pot whose water is changed again and again. Almost at once you see it working. The water clouds, then stains the colour of strong, dark tea. Change it, and the next soaking runs dark again, a little less each time. That brown water carrying off the bitterness is the poison leaving the nut. You keep going until the water finally runs clear, and the meal, when you taste a pinch of it, has gone from mouth puckering to bland and mild. Only then is it safe. Here is where medieval knowledge shows its edge. There are two ways to wash the poison out, and they are not equal. You can leach with cold water, slowly, over days. Or you can boil the acorns, which pulls the bitterness out much faster. The fast way sounds better until you understand what it costs. Boiling drags the starch out of the acorn right along with the poison. And that starch is the very thing that lets acorn meal behave like flour and bind into a loaf. Boil your acorns and you can eat them as mush, but you have ruined them for bread. Cold leach them slowly, and you keep the starch and the bread. Peasants who depended on that loaf took the slow road, even though it cost them days. Some went further. In parts of Europe, foragers added wood ash to the soaking water to speed things along. This was not superstition. Wood ash soaked in water makes a weak lye, rich in potassium carbonate, and that alkaline water pulls the acidic bitterness out faster and more completely than plain water can. They had no word for potassium carbonate. They simply noticed that the ash from last night's fire made this week's acorns edible sooner. And then, after all of it, comes the payoff. The washed meal is spread out and dried, then ground finer into a proper flour, dark brown and faintly sweet-smelling, nutty like a cross between chestnut and coffee. That first taste of a nut that days ago would have sickened you, now clean and mild, is a small triumph over nature. For a family in 1316, it was more than that. It was proof they would see the spring. There is one honest limit to acorn flour, and medieval bakers knew it in their hands even if they could not name it. Acorn flour has no gluten. Gluten is the stretchy web in wheat that traps gas and lets a loaf rise tall and airy. Without it, acorn flour bakes dense and heavy, closer to a flat, dark cake than a fluffy loaf. The smart move, whenever any grain at all could be found, was to stretch it. A little precious wheat, rye, or barley flour was mixed into the acorn meal. The grain gave the loaf its structure and rise. The acorn stretched the grain twice or 3 times as far. In a famine, a sack of wheat that would have lasted a week could be made to last a month if you cut it with acorn flour. That was the whole point. Acorn bread was not chosen for flavour. It was chosen because it turned a starving pantry into a surviving one. What exactly is the poison, and why does washing it away work? The bitter compounds in an acorn are called tannins. They are the same family of compounds that make black tea bitter and red wine dry your mouth. In small amounts they are harmless. In the amounts packed into a raw acorn, they are a real problem, and we now understand why. Tannins grab onto proteins and lock them up. That mouth-drying, puckering feeling is that reaction happening on your tongue. It is tannins binding to the proteins in your saliva. Now imagine that same reaction happening all through your digestive system, blocking your body from absorbing the nutrients in your own food. The clearest proof of how dangerous this is comes from the farm, not the kitchen. The Merck veterinary manual documents what happens when cattle eat too many green acorns. The tannins break down in the gut into gallic acid and related compounds, and those compounds attack the kidneys, killing off the fine filtering tubes inside them. Cattle have died this way. Sheep too. The poison in the nut under your shoe is strong enough to shut down the organs of an animal many times your size. Which raises an obvious question. If acorns can kill a cow, how do wild pigs and deer eat them all autumn and stay fine? The answer is a neat piece of biology. Animals that eat a lot of acorns produce special proteins in their saliva, rich in an amino acid called proline, that rush in and bind the tannins before they can do any harm. Deer and pigs come with a built-in defense. Humans do not make much of it. We cannot out-chemistry the acorn from the inside, so we had to do it from the outside in a basket of running water. Medieval peasants never knew any of this. They only knew the animals ate the raw nut and thrived, while they themselves had to wash it first. They got the method exactly right without ever knowing the reason. And the reward for all that work was real nutrition, not just empty filler. Processed acorn flour carries around 500 calories per 100 grams, and a large share of that comes from fat, which made it far more energy-dense than the wheat it replaced. For a body running on empty, that fat was gold, and its carbohydrate released slowly, a low, steady burn rather than a spike and crash. This was survival fuel in the most literal sense. And this was not some lonely trick known in one European valley. A 2022 study in the journal Foods traced acorn bread across 6 countries as a rural food that survived in the Mediterranean and the Middle East into the 20th century, roaring back every time war or drought made wheat scarce. Halfway around the world, the Miwok and Pomo of California built entire cuisines on the same cold water leaching. In Korea, that same logic still makes an acorn jelly called dotori muk today. Humanity kept reinventing one answer to the same hungry problem on every continent that grew an oak. And that is the thread underneath all of it. None of this has to stay on a screen. The loaves and the living leavens medieval bakers survived on were never fully lost, and people are baking them again right now. If you want to bake this history, instead of just watching it, that is what the Medieval Bakery Collection is for. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for building and keeping a living leaven of your own, the way these bakers did. And the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find the right heritage grain. It is all over at the Medieval Way store. And of all the places this bread held on, one island took the method further than anyone. On Sardinia, in a rugged region called Ogliastra, around the village of Baunai, they still make a bread called pane di ghianda, acorn bread, and their method carries a twist found almost nowhere else. They grind the acorns of the Holm oak, then boil them for hours with something surprising added to the pot. Iron-rich red clay, mixed with ash. It sounds like they are cooking with dirt. They are actually performing chemistry. Researchers who studied the method found the iron in that clay binds the leftover tannins and cancels the bitterness, while the clay's body helps the gluten-free flour hold together. They were using the earth itself to detoxify their food. And there is a final twist. Acorn bread was supposed to be a poverty food, the bread of shepherds and the desperate. But the women of Baunai became so skilled at making it, and it became so prized, that they reportedly sold their acorn bread for more than ordinary wheat bread. The famine food had become a delicacy. That almost never happens, and it tells you how good the loaf could be in the right hands. If acorn bread was nourishing, clever, and even sold at a premium in Sardinia, why did it vanish from the European table? The answer is not a villain. It is simply that the hunger went away. For as long as acorn bread survived, it survived because wheat was unreliable. It was famine insurance. Once modern farming, cheap grain, and steady trade made bread plentiful and reliable, the reason to spend a week of hard labour detoxifying nuts simply evaporated. Across most of the Mediterranean, acorn bread faded from everyday life after the 1950s. Nobody banned it. Nobody buried it on purpose. It just stopped being necessary, and a food that takes that much work does not survive without necessity. The knowledge slipped out of one generation's hands because the next never went hungry enough to need it. If you want to try this yourself, here is the honest, safe version. Start with about 3 pounds of acorns and favour sweet white oak acorns if you can identify them, because they carry the least bitterness and take the least work. Sort hard. Throw out anything capped, cracked, or wearing the small round exit hole of a weevil, and float test the rest, keeping only the ones that sink. Shell them, blend the meat with an equal amount of water into a slurry, and pour it into a large glass jar. Now you leach. Pour off the water and refill with fresh cold water once or twice a day, keeping the jar cool so it does not ferment. Sweet white oak acorns can be ready in about 3 days. Wilder oaks take a week, and eastern red oaks can take up to 10. No clock tells you when it is done. Your tongue does. When the wet meal tastes bland instead of bitter, the tannins are gone. Drain it, spread it thin, and dry it slowly under gentle heat because real heat scorches it dark. Grind it fine and sift. Then remember the gluten problem and start at roughly 1/4 acorn flour to 3/4 wheat, enough for the deep, nutty flavour while the wheat still lets the loaf rise. One rule stands above the rest. Never eat raw or half-leached acorns, and never bake with meal that still tastes bitter. Bitter means the tannins are still there. Bland means you have done exactly what medieval peasants did and turned a poison into food. Strip away the desperation, and what the medieval peasant did with a handful of acorns was quiet genius. They took a nut that poisons cattle, read the forest well enough to pick the gentler trees, and used nothing but water, ash, time, and patience to wash a toxin clean out of their food and turn it into bread. They did it without a single word of chemistry, guided only by watching, tasting, and remembering. We traded that knowledge for the comfort of never needing it, and for most of us, that is a fair trade. But the knowledge is not dead. It is still alive in a Sardinian village, baked for the festivals, remembered by the old. It was never really lost. It was just set down, waiting for someone to pick it back up. If digging up the skills that kept people alive when the world was trying to kill them is your kind of history, subscribe and keep digging with us. And tell me honestly down in the comments. Faced with a real famine, do you think you would have the patience to spend a week turning poison into bread? I read every reply. Until next time.